Thanks for coming. So I'm going to be talking about JavaScript best practices as they relate to what NextJump does and like the technology that NextJump uses. So there's going to be some code, so if you're not into looking at code, sorry. So the things I'm going to cover are namespacing and modules, event delegation, templating, and doing like complex or just like more interesting effects. So the first thing I'm going to jump into is namespacing and modules. So what that is just basically separating your code from other code. So that lets you reduce conflicts, encapsulate your logic, and reuse stuff in places. So I'm just going to jump into a demo in JSBin. If you guys have any questions at any point, just like stop me and ask. So here's some code. This is just importing the NextJump library. So this is prototype.js and Scriptaculous and that sort of stuff. I think there's a few more things in there, but that's not important. So I'm just going to show an example of what happens if you don't do namespacing, right? So we have a function that we're setting up where we're logging something. In a timeout, we want to call that function again. We're calling it, and then sometime later, this could be like elsewhere on the page or whatever, in like another bit of code, we're going to overwrite that function and then call it again, right? So if we run this, we see the original thing, the new thing, and then when this guy who thinks he's getting the original thing runs, it's actually the new thing because it's been overwritten. So none of this is namespaced. It's all in the global namespace, I guess. And that's no good. You're gonna have a lot of conflicts. This is like a contrived example, but that could happen in real life. So if we comment this guy out, come down here, so this, we're going to make a namespace. So we're going to set the NextJump namespace on the window. If it doesn't exist, we're going to just create it. And then this guy is going to be an IIFE, which is an immediately invoked function expression. So it's creating a function and then calling it immediately, basically. And that creates a scope in here. That's because JavaScript has function scope, not like block level scope. So we're going to do this sort of stuff. So this function, something in here, is actually not the same one as the one out here. So if we run this, we have a namespace something and some third thing, right? So we can call this again, and it's still the same thing. It hasn't been overwritten. Another advantage that this gives us, it lets us do private variables. So in this case, we're going to make another namespace. Oops, sorry. So it has a private variable which has this something private in it, right? So if we run it, this guy can read it, and it's awesome. This guy, it's actually going to be an error. In this case, would normally just be undefined. So that can't read this thing. So that way you can have logic that's like encapsulated within a module and doesn't get leaked to the outside world, right? I like this approach better than just setting a like JavaScript object to a namespace, because then you can have these private variables, and not everything that that you're defining in here is public. So that's kind of namespacing. So if we go back, anybody have any questions about that? Cool. So we're going to go on to event delegation. So what that means is basically handling events on behalf of a child element. So you would use it because normally event handlers only work for elements that are already on the page at the time of when you define the handler. It doesn't work if things are added to the DOM later. They won't get called for those. So we'll just go into another example. So we have these guys, right? We have one in the DOM by default. We added one later. And we added this event handler. This is the prototype syntax for event handlers. And so we click this guy, it logs, but this guy, it doesn't work because it was added after the fact. So if we remove this and then write this little delegate function, what it does is it observes the event on the parent object and then checks to see if it's been called on a child element. If it has, then it calls it like this. .call will basically set the this value of the function that you're calling. So we're setting this to the wrapped version of the element. This way we can continue to do stuff like this .innerHTML. So we'll call it on this thing. So basically we're looking at the elements parent, the click event, the .element child, and here's the handler. So now they both work. And you can do as many as you want. It doesn't matter. They all will work. So that's the basics of event delegation. It's kind of annoying to do in prototype because it's not built into the system. In jQuery, there's support for it in event handlers, but in prototype, we have to go with our own approach here. So anyone have any questions about event handling or event delegation? Cool. John?
Yeah. With the prototype, can't you put the listener on the body and then
Yeah, so we can change this guy. So John asked, in prototype, can you set the listener on the body? So you're saying just observe the click event on the body and then check to see if you clicked on an event. That's basically event delegation. So we're wrapping that functionality in a function, essentially. You can do the same here with like document.body, and it'll still work. So yeah, cool. So we're going to move right along into templating. So templating is basically constructing reusable templates for string interpolation. Prototype has like really basic template support, so it only supports string interpolation. You can't put logic in them, so they're not as robust as other templates, but they're built in, so we may as well use them. So the advantages are that you don't have to construct your HTML structures by hand, and it can be compiled once and used over and over. So I'll give an example of that. So here's like an example of string concatenation, right? So we have to, just jam all this stuff into a string and then insert it into the DOM. It's hard to reuse and hard to read and everything. So if we get rid of this guy, we can do a little bit better. We can do with these element creation. At least it's not like, dumping it all in a string. So now we're creating elements by hand, setting their class name and updating values. So we get the same output, but with a different way of doing it. This is still kind of verbose and hard to reuse. So if we go down here, we can use a template string and then create a template out of it, and then call it a few times with different values, right? So we're reusing this one string over and over just to dump the same thing to the DOM with different values. But even that is like kind of annoying. Oh, and sorry, this is one more example. You just do a bunch of times. Even that's kind of annoying because you have to define it in JavaScript, and you can only have, by default, like single line strings. It's kind of annoying. So what you can do is template from the DOM. So this is essentially going to be the same thing. I'm going to grab this example template, which has to have this type of text HTML. That prevents the browser from trying to evaluate this stuff as JavaScript. It's just basically treating it as just a placeholder element. So we use this same syntax and everything, but we can structure it like we would a normal bit of HTML, so with indenting and everything. And then we can do the same thing here. It all works. Right. The main advantage of this thing is with Ajax Events. So you would make a request to the server, come back, and just run it through a template. So we can do the same thing. Here's another example. I'm just using a little echo thing, and then that's this thing. The request is just basically returns us data as JSON response, and we run that through our template. So it has this origin and URL fields, which automatically just get pulled in like that. So that's templating. Does anybody have any questions about that? Cool. Cool. So moving right along into effects. So these are scriptaculous effects that can happen in parallel or in sequence. You don't have to guess about how long they're going to take, and you can ensure that everything is done when all of the events are done, or effects are done. So a quick example of that is, we have some ugly things over here, and we'll make some events or effects that happen in parallel, but they're kind of like you have to wait for the timeout and all this stuff, and then add this effect later in like a nested function. So that's kind of annoying. It's hard to reason about. So what you can do is just make a list of effects, or an array of effects, push them on here. You have to make sure to put the sync true. I actually forgot to do that. Whoops. So that makes sure that they don't run until the parallel effect actually takes place. and then they'll go. And the same you can do with this and put it on a queue. This puts it at the end of a queue. You can have named queues, so there's like namespaces. You can keep all your effects separate. And this will fade when all the other effects in the queue are done. So that's after this guy is done. And after finish, we can just log done. So with the same thing, we can do it as an event handler. So I'm just gonna. Oh, sorry, that's way too much. So now if we click this box, it'll kind of like zoom away and this other guy will come in. These are not the greatest events, I'm sorry, that was my bad, but at least this shows you what that you can do with them. You can change transitions and stuff like that. Cool, so I guess that's the basics of complex effects that you can do in parallel, make sure that events wait for each other, and you can push them onto queues and stuff like that. So I was going to give another example of putting it all together. So we're going to show a quick to-do list sort of thing. It's not saved in the browser, or not saved in a server or anything like that, but it's an example of everything put together. So we have a namespace of to-do, right? Everything is in here. And we're using a template for these to-do items, I guess. And then we're delegating clicks onto the body and lists and stuff like that. So this to-do is added after the fact, like this. And I can still do all of these things with it, and all of this works. So that's kind of an example of how everything could work together. There's a lot more depth to this sort of stuff. This is kind of just showing the surface of everything. So yeah, I guess that's about everything I have.